Hi, and welcome to the unofficial start of Connect Safely Live. I say unofficial because we're talking on Zoom right now, but the audience will also be on Facebook, and there's a delay. So I'm looking in the left corner of my screen. You can't see it unless you're one of the panelists, and a little red indicator will come on when we're on Facebook, and that's when I'll officially start the show. It could happen any second now, but I'm going to say hello to Kerry in the meantime. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Larry. How's it going out there on the West Coast?
It's good. And quick hello to Alan, who I will introduce in just a minute.
Hello, Larry.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
And now let's be silent as we wait for that light to come on. It works most of the time. There have been cases where it's failed, but not lately. Hi, welcome to Connect Safely Live. I'm your host, Larry Magid, joined with my co-host, Kerry Gallagher. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Larry. Great to see you again today. I'm excited for today's show with our guest.
I am too, and our guest is Alan Miller, and Alan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and currently the founder and CEO of the News Literacy Project. He was a reporter at the LA Times for 21 years before leaving in 2008 to establish the News Literacy Project, and he spent most of his time in the Times Washington Bureau and has also been involved in a number of investigative journalism projects. His work prompted investigations by the Justice Department, Congress, and inspectors general and the federal agencies that led to congressional hearings, reforms, and criminal convictions. So it's great to see somebody who's a veteran, prize-winning journalist also involved with helping Americans better process how we're dealing with the media.
Thanks, Larry. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, Alan. And I should say, Alan and I have a mutual friend, Walter Mossberg, who for many years was the tech columnist for the Wall Street Journal, is sort of the glue between the two of us. So it's a great pleasure to speak with him. I want to start by defining media literacy, or news literacy, as you call it. It's more broad-reaching than the common misconception that media literacy is simply the ability to spot fake news. So let's talk about what you mean by news literacy or media literacy.
Well, when we talk about news literacy, we're talking about the ability to discern and create credible information, to be able to sort fact from fiction in whatever one encounters, and to have the ability to be an informed and engaged participant in the civic life of one's community and the country. We also emphasize having an understanding and appreciation of both the role of the First Amendment and a free press and democracy. One thing that I'll add, we believe that this is an absolute survival skill, an essential skill in the age in which we're living.
So, Alan, the president refers to mainstream media as fake news. Now, you and I both worked for the LA Times and other credible mainstream news outlets. I just recently left the CBS News after 20 years. And I have some strong feelings about what I consider to be the integrity of the vast majority of reporters and journalists for these outlets. Yet, we have been branded as a whole as fake. And I was wondering if you would comment about what that has done to media, what that means, and how should we parse those kind of attacks coming from the highest office of the land?
Well, actually, I think it's fake news is not a very helpful term. I think that, it was initially coined to talk about false content that was created to look like news, and it has really been weaponized and politicized in a way that I think makes it quite counterproductive. There is obviously false content and misinformation that is often knowingly created as false, meant to mislead and misinform. And I think those are more applicable terms to use. In terms of the news business, Larry, as we both know, it's imperfect by its nature. Journalists make mistakes because of the rush of deadlines and competitive pressure, and sources mislead, and there's human error. And truth often takes time to emerge. But quality journalists don't make things up. And if they do at a credible news outlet, there are serious repercussions. So I think it's important to make that distinction between journalism and what is truly mis and disinformation.
Yeah, I want to kind of highlight what you just said about the repercussions and also the internal angst that one goes through when they make a mistake. I remember once when I was writing for the New York Times, I accidentally put the wrong price down on a product, and nobody was going to die from that mistake. But I was horrified and very embarrassed and insisted that my editor make a correction, because accuracy is accuracy. And even though it was almost inconsequential, it really meant a lot to me to get it right and embarrassing to get it wrong. And I think that's generally true among most journalists, that when we do make mistakes, we're embarrassed and want to correct them right away.
Well, this is one of the things that distinguishes journalism from so much else. There are standards that are applied, and one of those standards is accountability. So if a journalist or a news organization makes a mistake, they should correct it and correct it quickly. I know that I spent 29 years as a reporter. I wrote thousands of stories, and there wasn't one time that I didn't lie awake at night thinking about every name and date and fact, and making sure that I had it right.
Right. Kerry?
Speaking of standards, I found it very sort of dynamic that when you talked about what news literacy or media literacy is, you talked about it as a survival skill. I think that really lends itself to how important this skill is under these especially current circumstances with the really life and death issues that all of us are considering every day. I wanted to talk a little bit about the statement that your organization, the News Literacy Project, just released. It's called A Statement on Racial Justice, a Free Press, and the Right to Protest. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that statement and why, what you said in that statement, and why it's so important for Americans to understand those sentiments.
Well, first and foremost, we thought that it was important that we express our support for Black Lives Matter and the effort to create, to combat police violence and to create greater racial justice. And that was the first and foremost. We also wanted to underscore the importance of the First Amendment at this time, not just in terms of the rights of speech and press, but also to peaceably assemble and to redress grievances, petition the government to redress grievances. And we also noted that the attacks on journalists are really an assault on democracy, and called upon officials to step in and prevent those things from continuing to happen.
Alan, you mentioned the First Amendment, which I've read very carefully, and as you know, it refers to government. And I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between First Amendment protections in terms of government's restrictions of the press and issues about alleged conservatism or or I should say censorship, conservative censorship coming from social media. How does the First Amendment apply, and when does it not apply?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, the First Amendment states that the government shall make no laws that abridge freedom of press and speech and religion and assembly and the ability to petition the government. That does not apply in the same way to private companies that make decisions all the time about what information that they are publishing or sharing or permitting, on their platforms. And I think there's sometimes confusion about that in the discussion about, the role of the social media companies in particular to curb certain kinds of content on their platforms.
I'm sort of having flashbacks to law school. First Amendment law was one of my favorite courses. And it really kind of, what you just said really connects to the idea that the Constitution is meant to define and limit the government. It isn't meant to define and limit citizens. And in some cases, corporations are the expression of sort of citizens' desires to have an impact on their economy or others as well. And in that vein, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where we as Americans get our news, right? We get our news from other citizens in many cases via these social media platforms that you're talking about. I think it can be a little bit generational. I think people in certain generations are more or less likely to get their news from different sources. And so how do those of us who are in one generation and are raising another generation, how can we help teach those media literacy skills to our children who maybe are getting their news and interacting with their news from different platforms than we are?
So you're absolutely right, Kerry. I mean, what we know is that young people today are getting much of their news, as well as all kinds of other information, from social media, largely from their devices, often from their phones, and it's disaggregated. It's not coming from a news outlet. It's coming amidst everything else, and they may not even recognize that it's news. And exponentially more of what they're seeing is not intended to inform them, in a dispassionate and accurate and fair way, but it's intended to persuade or to exploit or to mislead or misinform. So that's why it's so critical that we give the next generation the tools to be able to ask themselves, what are they seeing? Where is it coming from? What is its purpose? What is the documentation? What is the bias? And is this something that they should trust and that they should share and that they should act on?
Yeah, great points. Talking through intentionally how to process that, I think, is really essential. We started down the path talking about the NLP's statement on racial justice. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. When it comes to the ongoing conversation about racial justice that really we've been having in this country for a long time, it's just sort of more top of mind right now, and it's in the media more right now. What are the news literacy skills that Americans should really focus on employing when they're watching the news right now? And it's worth noting they're processing extremely emotional footage and images. So how do we sort of process all of that information when it's also impacting us emotionally?
So it's a great question. First of all, I think we need to remember that whenever there is a major story with fast breaking news, and now we've got a lot of it happening all the time, both with the protests and of course with the pandemic, that is a time when we are particularly vulnerable to being manipulated because our emotions are engaged and we feel anger or sadness or fear. And at that point, we are really vulnerable. So I think we need to recognize that and really pause and take stock of how we're reacting to what we're seeing, and then to ask ourselves those fundamental questions about, where did this come from? Can we tell? Is this from a credible source? What are the sources that are quoted or we're hearing from? Are we hearing from multiple sides? Is it being presented in a manner that is intended to inform, or clearly is it intended to inflame or provoke? What's the documentation? What bias are we bringing to what we're looking at, and what bias might we be seeing in what we're consuming? And then ultimately to ask that very important question, is this something that I should truly trust? Is it credible? And there are places to look. There are independent fact-checking organizations you can look to. There are some basic skills you can learn about reverse image searching to check images. And then really to be responsible, because a big part of the problem with misinformation is that many of us, most of us, are sharing it, whether inadvertently or intentionally, and really spreading this virus. And I think we all need to be mindful about the role that we play in the information ecosystem, particularly at such a fraught time as we're living through now.
You bring up an interesting point, and before I get to the question I was going to ask you, I want to talk about the responsibility that we have when we see something online that is questionable. We may know it's false, we may wonder about it. I frequently will see reports and I'm thinking, looks a little fishy, but I really don't know it to be false, and I will do a little research. And at the point when I do know it's false, I will often say, provide a link to the accuracy, either say that it was satire, which people are falling for more and more, or more likely it was just a fake news story that was planted deliberately to mislead people. But I'm wondering what your response, what you recommend people's response should be, and how we can go about doing that without necessarily getting into a flaming war.
So you're absolutely right. I think that we need to not only be mindful ourselves, but we need to push back against misinformation, whether it's somebody we know who's sending these kind of things to us or we see it. And we all need to become upstanders for facts. And so one answer is, and you can do it respectfully and diplomatically, as you said, with a link to where the credible information or where the source that's debunking that piece is coming from. And then the other thing is there's a term about flooding the zone with more credible information. So to the extent we can, we should be sharing, if we're engaged in social media, whether on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, sharing reliable sources or sharing sources that are debunking misinformation, because those who are spreading it, the propagators, are doing it on a ongoing, really extended basis. And there's no barrier to entry. There's a lot of incentive, whether it's to make money, whether it's for ideological reasons or partisan reasons, or to cause mischief.
Yeah.
So we need to really push back against that to, I think, avoid becoming what we're moving toward, which is a kind of misinformation dystopia.
It's funny, just as we're told to do everything we can to avoid spreading COVID, I also think it's important that we avoid spreading false information. And I have had well-meaning, educated friends share things with me that they thought were true, and I've had to inform them that even though that they meant well, they had accidentally shared false information. So I think that's the factor also, being careful not to share anything that we don't have good reason to believe is true. I wanted to segue back to the question on racial justice, and both the George Floyd and the more recent Rayshard Brooks episode in Atlanta were examples of Black men being killed by police, but the situations were very different. Yet at the same time, they're being presented in the same vein. And I'm curious how, both as a media companies and as consumers, we need to parse those different situations. One was clearly an act of murder. I don't know if I'm editorializing. I think I'm reporting here fairly accurately. And the other one was a situation where the guy was running and had a taser, and one could argue possibly that the police thought that they were in some danger. I'm not sure. I don't want to take a position on what happened, but I do want to acknowledge that sometimes there are nuances and subtleties that get lost in the reporting and the analysis.
So obviously there's in both cases, there's a considerable amount of video.
Yes.
Interestingly, we didn't necessarily, certainly in the George Floyd case, see all the video initially. It didn't obviously change what had happened and how it happened, but you do see more information emerge over time in stories like this, and more context. Often it may be that making it even more horrific and outrageous what happened in the case of George Floyd in particular. And in other cases, as you say, there may be some more complexity, and it's a matter of following the reporting across many sources, following the story over time. And then on these stories, though, there is an awful lot that we can see for ourselves. And thank goodness, we've got the access to this kind of video now. It's one of the great benefits of the age in which we live, that so much of this can be captured, because we've seen even in some of these recent cases where the police reports are really sort of whitewashed the incident and didn't report on what had actually occurred and the injustice that had occurred till we saw the video and had more information.
I think what you just said really struck me, because it isn't just about the initial report that comes out of an incident. There's a whole context that goes into our news literacy, right? So in addition to the video and the police report and the initial reports on the event from journalists, there's the institutional framework or the community within which that instance happened, that we as citizens maybe have an obligation to dig deeper into. So when we talk about all of those factors, I think it can seem kind of intimidating to your average American citizen to feel like, how much information do I have to wade through before I know that I have a really accurate picture of what happened and what the causes and effects were. I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of how do we manage that, maybe that responsibility as citizens without overwhelming ourselves.
Well, Kerry, you're absolutely right in terms of as a story emerges over time. So an incident will occur, and then we will learn subsequently that there was a history of police violence in a given police organization, or that we'll learn that the police officers involved have a history of mistreating suspects or using their weapons inappropriately. that provides a wider context. And of course, this is so much of this is about context in the terms of this systemic racism and racial injustice that we're seeing documented and now much discussed. So I think that it's incumbent upon the consumer to, as I said, to follow these stories over time, to follow them from multiple credible sources, and to ultimately come to an informed view of what of their own beliefs, and then potentially their own actions as well.
Alan, when it comes to such things as racial injustice or the pandemic or electoral politics, there are news stories, and then there is analysis. And of course, analysis and opinion are sometimes mixed together, and maybe you can talk about the difference. But when I think about watching cable news especially, there's an endless 24-hour series of talking heads that regurgitate and analyze and opinionate about all of these issues. And I personally have cut back some of my consumption simply because I've gotten overwhelmed, especially during the pandemic. I would not only be overwhelmed, but start getting depressed and afraid and sort of spiraling emotionally about this horrible situation. But again, even when it's politics, at what point is enough enough? At what point does it make sense both for adults to walk away from the television or maybe put down the newspaper, and also for children or young people, perhaps limiting their media diet as well?
Well, in fact, the World Health Organization said that the amount of information, including misinformation, coming out about the pandemic is an infodemic, and is somewhat overwhelming. And you see this even before this recent series of enormous stories with the protests and the pandemic, that people feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that they're subjected to. So I think, again, particularly during a period people are locked down and they tend to be more dependent on social media and the media in general, it's probably healthy to take a time out, to limit it, to take a break from it, because it can be overwhelming, and it's much of it is so painful and upsetting. Seeing these videos of George Floyd and the other killings over and over again, for instance. So I think people have to, monitor that for their own emotional well-being.
I like the term infodemic, and I wanted to transition to talk a little bit about the pandemic and the phase that we're in right now. Many of us are concerned about our health and staying well. And I think initially it was very easy to follow the guidelines. It was stay home unless it's absolutely necessary. You're an essential worker. If you are an essential worker, these are the clear guidelines. Things are a little bit more squishy now. So we're getting mixed messages about whether it's best to go out to restart the economy so that, we're providing that contribution to our fellow Americans, or is it best to stay in and not expose ourselves and others to the virus and sort of do that for our fellow Americans? So a lot of people are getting these mixed messages. What advice do you have for Americans who aren't sure which decision is the right one right now?
Well, there still remains so much uncertainty and so much that we don't know. I mean, we still don't know precisely, how the virus started. And we still don't know if you have had it, if you have immunity, or how long the immunity might last. And then we've gotten mixed messages, obviously, from public officials about everything from, wearing masks to opening up the country and the economy again. So look, I think some things are pretty clear where you've got the public health officials are in agreement, which is that the one thing is the virus hasn't gone anywhere. It's still out there. It's still tremendously opportunistic. People of all ages can be vulnerable, though obviously older people and people with pre-existing conditions are more vulnerable. It makes sense to continue to be careful, no matter what you do, to keep social distance, to wear masks, to wash your hands often, to be cognizant, of surfaces that you're touching, particularly in circumstances where you're indoors and you're more vulnerable. And I think to follow those credible sources, Dr. Fauci and other public health officials who continue to talk about the need to be very careful and mindful, not only protect yourself, but to protect others as well.
You know, speaking of that kind of misinformation and mentioning Dr. Fauci, who is a federal employee, we are getting misinformation from sources that have traditionally been considered credible. The White House, state governments putting out incomplete or skewed medical data on the pandemic. And that's something that I'm having trouble grappling with, because I'm just not used to that. I'm sure we all know that politicians, like anybody else, can make a mistake, and sometimes there are, people will exaggerate, or they'll spin, or they might tell a lie here and there. But the level in which we're dealing with it right now is, in my opinion, unprecedented. And I don't know how to parse that kind of information, given that it's coming from sources that used to be considered very trustworthy.
It's made the entire landscape much more challenging. I mean, there's no question. I think, we've got to look to independent sources of information to verify it. And I would point to credible news sources who are reporting. It's one of the reasons that there are questions about some of those reports are because of stories that news organizations have done are raising those issues, talking to their own credible sources and looking at the data and the reports. So that's and I think looking at a wide variety, not relying on any one source to make decisions about what to trust. But it is, Larry, it is daunting. There's no question about it.
A question I have as a parent of a young adolescent. So I have an 11-year-old. I also have an 8-year-old. My 11-year-old is very clearly becoming more aware of the news, whereas my 8-year-old is still a little bit sort of blissfully unaware, even if it's being broadcast in the room around her. She's kind of doing her own thing. I think developmentally, every child arrives at that awareness at a different time, but my 11-year-old is hearing and processing these massive statistics, like, over 100,000 people now, well over, have been tested positive for COVID-19. And she's hearing terms like systemic racism and asking me a lot of questions. What advice do you have for parents of children who are just kind of coming of age in terms of their news literacy in the midst of all of this? Normally we can partner with teachers and schools to help them develop these skills, but we don't have that partnership right now.
So we actually have made our virtual classroom available to parents who are homeschooling. We're about to take a break for the summer, but it's Checkology at checkology.org. We also have an app called Informable, which is a game that assesses and builds news literacy skills. And I would encourage, that's something parents can certainly use, and they can actually play with their kids either competitively or cooperatively. I would encourage parents to use some of the basic techniques we're talking about, to discuss with students, their children, where they're getting their news and information. What questions are they asking about where it came from, who created it, for what purpose, and whether it's something that's credible based on the sources, the documentation, the nature of it, and to sit down and look at each of these things with them, and start to begin to instill habits of mind that will lead to more literate children going forward. I think that there's an opportunity here, particularly as children like your own, Kerry, are engaged with these issues, to focus on their consumption habits and their habits of mind, to make them more effective critical thinkers of the news and information.
And that's a great place to wrap this up. Critical thinking is something that we talk about all the time at Connect Safely. And as you know, Kerry and I also wrote a booklet called Parents and Educators Guide to Media Literacy and Fake News, which is supplemental to all the great material that the News Literacy Project has published. And for our viewers, why don't you remind them exactly how they can get to your website and take advantage of your great resources?
So they can find us at newslit.org. And they can also, as I mentioned, find the virtual classroom checkology.org. Our mobile app is informable, and it can be accessed through the App Store or Google Play. And we also have a weekly newsletter called The Sift that takes that week's viral rumors, conspiracy theories, and hoaxes and turns them into timely lessons and teachable moments. And people can subscribe to that. And all of our resources are free and are available at no cost. So we welcome more people using them.
Well, Alan Miller, the head of and founder of the News Literacy Project, thank you very much. Kerry, as usual, thank you for your great contribution. And I love the fact that you ask questions from the perspective of both an educator and a parent.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to mention, Alan, several of my colleagues at the school where I work, we are big fans of the SIFT and rely on it to be delivered to our inboxes often. So thank you for publishing it.
And I would want to remind viewers live that this will be archived on Facebook and also at ConnectSafely.org/live. So you can look at it and share it with your friends. And I do urge you to share it, maybe do a watch party, because this is the kind of information that I think really needs to get out there to just about everybody. We all have to deal with the media landscape we live in. It's challenging, even for those of us who are professional journalists. And I do think it's important for the information that Alan came up with to get as widespread comment and distribution as possible. So again, Alan and Kerry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.